It was a quiet afternoon at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where locals gathered daily for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. The hum of conversation filled the air, blending with the sound of clinking dishes and the soft murmur of music playing from a dusty radio in the corner. For most of the regulars, it was just another ordinary day. But all of that was about to change. The door swung open, and a man stepped in. He was tall, dressed neatly in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks. His presence carried an air of confidence, yet there was something unassuming about him, as though he wasn't looking to draw attention. He glanced around the room, his dark brown eyes scanning the tables for a seat. He smiled politely at a few patrons before walking toward the counter. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 40s, her name badge pinned crookedly to her faded uniform. She was busy wiping down the counter, her brow furrowed with the kind of weariness that spoke of long hours and little patience. When she looked up and saw the man approaching, her face hardened. Her gaze shifted from neutral to something sharper, colder. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. The man nodded, his voice calm and polite. "Yes, please. I'd like a cup of coffee and a menu, if you don't mind." For a moment, she didn't move. Instead, she stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. The room seemed to grow quieter, the usual chatter dimming as a few heads turned to watch the exchange. "We don't serve people like you here," she said flatly, her words cutting through the air like a knife. A hush fell over the diner. Some of the patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others avoided looking at the counter altogether. The man's expression didn't waver. He stood there, his calm demeanor unshaken by the weight of her words. "I'm sorry," he replied evenly, his tone measured. "I don't think I understand. I'm just here for a coffee." The woman crossed her arms, her stance firm. "I said we don't serve your kind. Maybe you should take your business elsewhere." The man took a slow breath, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet strength. It was clear he wasn't here to cause a scene, but he also wasn't going to back down easily. "You're sure about that?" he asked, his voice still steady. There was a slight edge to his tone now, a subtle shift that hinted at something more beneath his polite exterior. The woman's jaw tightened. "I'm sure." The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. A few of the customers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should step in or stay silent. What the woman didn't know, and what nobody else in the diner realized, was who this man really was. And in a matter of moments, everything she thought she knew was about to be turned upside down. The diner remained unnervingly silent as the man stood there, his calm exterior masking whatever he might have been feeling inside. The woman behind the counter, her stance rigid, seemed to grow more resolute with each passing second. Her words had drawn an invisible line in the sand, and she was clearly daring him to cross it. But the man didn't move. Instead, he glanced around the room again, as if taking in every detail: the customers, the cracked tiles on the floor, the flickering neon sign outside the window. His gaze finally settled back on her. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted a cup of coffee." Her lips pursed tightly, her eyes narrowing. "You heard me," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to make sure everyone in the diner could hear. "You're not welcome here. You can take your coffee somewhere else." The man let out a soft sigh, his shoulders relaxing slightly, but his eyes never left hers. He reached into his pockets slowly, causing a few patrons to tense up, but all he pulled out was a small leather wallet. He opened it and slid something out, a sleek, black card that caught the light as he held it up. "Are you sure about that?" he asked again, this time with a subtle shift in his tone. It wasn't anger or arrogance, it was something else. Something that hinted he knew more than he was letting on. The woman squinted at the card, her expression flickering for the briefest moment before hardening again. I don't care who you are or what you have, she said, though her voice faltered just slightly. Rules are rules. One of the customers sitting at a nearby table, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a trucker's cap, cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe you should just let him have his coffee, Cheryl, he murmured, his eyes darting between the man and the woman behind the counter. Cheryl, if that was her name, shot him a glare that could have cut through steel. You stay out of this, Bill, she snapped. This is my diner, and I make the rules here. The man at the counter didn't flinch. Instead, he slipped the card back into his wallet and folded his hands on the counter, leaning in slightly. This is your diner, huh? He asked, his tone conversational now, as though they were talking about the weather. You own this place? Cheryl hesitated, her expression tightening. My family's owned it for years, she said defensively. Built it from the ground up. So, yeah, it's mine. The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. There was no malice in his gaze, no hostility, just a calm curiosity that seemed to unnerve her more than any amount of anger could. That's impressive, he said, nodding. It's not easy to keep a business running for that long. Takes a lot of hard work, dedication. He paused, his eyes meeting hers again. And good customer service. Cheryl bristled, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Don't you lecture me about how to run my business, she snapped. I've been doing this long enough to know what I'm doing. The man raised his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. I'm not trying to tell you how to run your business, he said calmly. But I do think you might want to reconsider how you treat your customers. Her eyes narrowed again, and for a moment, it looked like she was about to say something else, something harsher, but then the door to the diner opened, and a new wave of customers walked in. A group of 3, 2 men and a woman entered, chatting quietly amongst themselves. They paused when they saw the tension in the room, their conversation trailing off as they exchanged uneasy glances. One of the men, younger and dressed in a crisp suit, stepped forward hesitantly. Is everything okay here? He asked, his eyes flicking between the man at the counter and Cheryl. Cheryl straightened up, forcing a tight smile onto her face. Everything's fine, she said quickly, her tone sharp enough to suggest she didn't want anyone else involved. We were just having a little misunderstanding. The man in the suit didn't look convinced, but he nodded politely and led his group to an empty table near the window. The room gradually filled with the low hum of conversation again, though the tension lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. The man at the counter didn't say anything else. He simply stood there for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking toward the door. But just before he stepped outside, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. I'll be back, he said, his voice calm but firm. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And with that, he pushed the door open and walked out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving the diner buzzing with whispers and speculation. Cheryl watched him go, her jaw clenched and her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but something about him unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. As the door swung shut behind him, she had the distinct feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The door to the diner clicked shut behind him, and the quiet murmur of conversation in the room seemed to swell like the calm before a storm. Cheryl's hands gripped the counter harder, her fingernails digging into the worn surface. She had no idea who that man was, but something about the way he looked at her, the calm, unwavering certainty in his eyes, gnawed at her insides. She had spent years running this diner, building it from the ground up. She had dealt with rude customers, late-night brawls, and everything in between, but this felt different. This felt personal. Her gaze drifted to the table where Bill, the trucker, was sitting, shaking his head with an uncomfortable glance her way. He knew something was off. A few other patrons were still eyeing her, some uncertain, others simply confused. They had all heard the exchange, and they were now waiting for the next move. She was aware of it. But what could she do? She had made herself clear. No one like him was welcome in her diner. She wasn't going to back down, not now. The diner had been her family's legacy, and she was its protector. She wasn't going to let anyone undermine that, especially not some stranger who thought he could waltz in and change the rules. Cheryl's thoughts were interrupted when a loud clink came from the other end of the counter. She turned quickly to see the older woman sitting at the farthest booth, a regular who came in every Thursday for the same order: coffee and a bagel. Her name was Helen, and her gnarled hands shook slightly as she set down her empty cup, her eyes narrow with quiet judgment. "You're making a mistake, Cheryl," Helen said softly, her voice like sandpaper. Cheryl froze. She had always respected Helen, admired her quiet wisdom, but hearing those words made her blood run cold. She didn't need anyone questioning her right now. "What are you talking about?" Cheryl snapped, her voice higher than she intended. Helen didn't flinch. "That man you turned away, he's someone important. You don't know who you're messing with." Cheryl shook her head, forcing a scoff. "Important? Please, Helen. I've been doing this long enough to know who belongs and who doesn't. That man was no different." Helen's eyes, though weary, never wavered. "He's not just some random guy, Cheryl. I've seen him before. He's connected. And if you think you can treat him like that and get away with it, you're mistaken." Cheryl's stomach churned. She didn't believe it. What could a man in a suit possibly have that would be so dangerous? And yet, the way Helen spoke. There was an undertone to her voice, a warning that Cheryl couldn't ignore. She swallowed hard and turned back to face the room, trying to push the conversation from her mind. But it lingered. Across the room, Bill the trucker was now looking at her with a mixture of pity and concern. He had been coming to the diner for years, but he had seen more than his fair share of things in his travels, and Cheryl suspected he knew a lot more about the world outside the walls of her small town than she ever did. "Cheryl, I'm not saying what you did was right, but—" Bill started, his voice hesitant as he stood up from his seat. "Maybe you ought to reconsider things. You don't want to get on the wrong side of people like him." She shot him a sharp look. "I told you to stay out of this, Bill." Bill held up his hands in mock surrender, a slow sigh escaping him. "I'm just saying. Think about it. There's more to this than you know." He turned to walk toward the door, casting one last glance back at her. "I'm just trying to help you avoid trouble, that's all." Cheryl's anger bubbled up again, but she had to swallow it. The diner had been her life for so long, and she wasn't going to let some stranger or anyone, for that matter, walk in and take it away from her. She turned toward the kitchen and grabbed the cloth hanging over the counter, wiping it down furiously, trying to rid herself of the gnawing sense of unease that had taken hold. Out on the street, the man who she now realized she still didn't know the name of had walked away from the diner, his figure slowly disappearing into the distance. Cheryl tried to tell herself that this was the last time she'd think about him, but she couldn't stop herself. There was something in the way he had spoken, in the way he held himself, that had unsettled her. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the lunchtime rush. The bell above the door rang as more customers trickled in. The normal routine of the diner returned, but there was an undercurrent of tension now. The usual banter felt off, like a song being played out of tune. Cheryl caught a few curious glances thrown her way as she moved between the tables. She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her thoughts kept returning to that moment with the man at the counter. His confidence, his calm demeanor, and then that card. She couldn't stop thinking about it. She knew she had to find out more, but a part of her dreaded what she might discover. Hours passed. The diner was quieter now, and Cheryl was preparing to close up when the bell above the door jingled again. This time, she didn't expect it. When she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. It was him. The man. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a figure in a black suit, tall and imposing. The air in the room seemed to shift, thickening with an undeniable presence. This wasn't just a customer anymore. Cheryl felt a knot tighten in her chest as the man walked toward the counter once more, his eyes locked on hers. "I told you I'd be back," he said, his voice steady, almost soothing. But the words sent a shiver down her spine. Cheryl's throat went dry, and before she could say anything, the man in the suit spoke. His voice was deep, commanding. "You've caused a bit of trouble today, Cheryl. We need to talk." Her heart raced, and for a split second, she wondered if she had made a grave mistake. She had no idea who these men were, but something about the way they carried themselves told her they were not to be trifled with. The room grew even quieter, and Cheryl knew whatever was coming next, she wasn't ready for it. Cheryl's pulse quickened as the two men approached the counter. The man in the suit, the one who hadn't spoken yet, stood still as if weighing her every move, while the first man, still dressed in the same neat button-down shirt, moved with a kind of quiet purpose. His calm demeanor only made Cheryl feel more on edge. There was something about him, about the way he looked at her, that felt too calculating, too deliberate. She took a step back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The counter was a barrier between them, and she could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on her, filling the small space with an invisible tension. It felt suffocating. I don't know what you want," Cheryl stammered, trying to find her voice, but it came out shaky. The man in the suit didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat down slowly, his every movement deliberate. The man in the button-down shirt remained standing, his hands resting casually on the counter. Cheryl noticed how clean his nails were, how his watch gleamed in the dim light of the diner. Nothing about him was ordinary. "I'm sorry if I upset you earlier," Cheryl said, her voice more defensive now. "But I told you this is my diner. I have rules." The man in the suit raised a hand, cutting her off. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, never left hers. "We're not here to argue over your rules, Cheryl," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "We're here because we need to talk." The words hung in the air like a warning. Cheryl's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to keep her composure, but she could feel the room closing in on her. "About what?" she managed, forcing herself to breathe evenly despite the rising panic inside her. The man in the button-down shirt exchanged a glance with the man in the suit, then looked back at Cheryl. "About who you turned away," he said, his tone still neutral, though there was something beneath the surface that hinted at impatience. "And why?" Cheryl swallowed hard. She could feel her throat dry up, her hands clammy, but she refused to let them see how shaken she was. "You said it yourself," she said, trying to muster some confidence. "He's not welcome here." The man in the suit leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "That's where you're wrong," he said softly. "He is welcome here. And now so are we." For a brief moment, Cheryl couldn't understand what he meant. What did he mean by that? And who were these men really? What did they want from her? The man in the suit let out a small sigh, as if he were tired of explaining things. "Cheryl, this isn't about your diner. It's not about your rules or your legacy." His voice dropped lower, the words taking on an almost sinister quality. "It's about your future. Your safety." Cheryl recoiled slightly, her mind racing to make sense of what he was saying. But nothing made sense. This wasn't just about a cup of coffee anymore. There was something much bigger going on, something she couldn't quite grasp. "We know about you," the man in the suit continued, his voice cold. "Your family. Your history. The people you've crossed. Cheryl's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? Her voice cracked, but she couldn't stop it. The man's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was one that sent a chill down her spine. You don't know who you're dealing with, Cheryl. But you will soon enough. Cheryl's thoughts raced, her mind spinning out of control. Who were these men? What was it that she had done or had been part of that she didn't know? And then it hit her. The card. The one he had shown her earlier. The sleek black card. She'd been too distracted, too wrapped up in her own pride and anger to really think about it, but now it suddenly seemed important. That card must have meant something far bigger than she had realized. Her breath caught in her throat. What? What do you want from me? She asked, the words barely a whisper. The man in the suit straightened up, his eyes still fixed on her with unnerving precision. We don't want anything from you, he said, his voice suddenly shifting. There was an edge to it now, a dangerous undertone that made Cheryl's skin crawl. But we're going to make sure you understand what happens when people like you make the wrong choice. The tension in the diner seemed to thicken, the silence stretching long and uncomfortable. Cheryl's mind raced to find an escape, to grasp any shred of control in a situation that was quickly spiraling beyond her understanding. And then, just as she thought the room couldn't get any more suffocating, the man in the button-down shirt stepped closer to the counter, his eyes still locked onto hers. This is your final warning, he said, his voice quiet but lethal. You don't want to find out what happens if you don't listen. Cheryl's heart hammered in her chest. She felt small. Helpless. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted, and now she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the world below her collapsing. Before she could respond, the bell above the door rang again. This time, it was different. The door swung open with a loud creak, and Cheryl's breath caught in her throat as she saw who had entered. A figure stepped into the diner, a familiar face. It was a man she hadn't seen in years. A man who had been part of her life once, long ago, someone she had almost forgotten about. And as his eyes met hers, Cheryl realized with a jolt of panic that this was no coincidence. Everything was about to change. Cheryl's heart skipped a beat as the man stepped into the diner. His familiar face sent a shockwave of disbelief through her, making her knees almost buckle beneath her. She hadn't seen him in years, not since the day he disappeared without a trace. His sudden appearance here, now, when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control, was nothing short of a nightmare. For a long moment, their eyes locked. He hadn't changed much, still tall, still with the same sharp jawline and dark eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. But something was different about him. The man who had once been her ally, her partner in so many things, now looked cold, detached. A stranger in every sense of the word. Cheryl's mouth went dry. The men at the counter were momentarily distracted by his entrance, but they quickly returned their attention to her, their expressions unreadable. The man in the suit didn't flinch, but Cheryl could see the briefest flicker of recognition in his eyes. The new arrival didn't waste any time. He walked directly toward her, his movements purposeful, almost predatory. When he reached the counter, he stopped. For a moment, all that could be heard was the hum of the diner's old refrigerator and the quiet murmur of the other patrons, all too nervous to speak. Cheryl, he said, his voice low but clear. It's been a long time. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, as if something was choking her from the inside. How could he be here? What was he doing with these men? And why now, of all times? The man in the button-down shirt finally spoke, breaking the tension in the air. You know him? His voice was flat, almost bored, but the undercurrent of menace was unmistakable. Cheryl's eyes darted between the two men and the newcomer, panic bubbling inside her chest. She had to think fast. She couldn't let these people, whoever they were, see her break. She couldn't let them know how rattled she felt. The newcomer's gaze flickered toward the two men at the counter, but then he fixed his eyes on Cheryl again, his lips curling into a faint, almost mocking smile. "You're still playing this game, aren't you?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of something darker. "You haven't learned a thing, have you?" Cheryl blinked, trying to make sense of his words. The last time she'd seen him, they'd been on the same side. They had been partners, working together in ways that had once felt unstoppable. But now, everything about him felt wrong. Before she could respond, the man in the suit stood up and stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge the newcomer directly but turned his cold gaze toward Cheryl. "You might want to listen to him," he said. "He knows things about you, things you don't even know about yourself." Cheryl's stomach twisted. What were they talking about? What had they all been involved in that she hadn't known? She felt the walls closing in around her again, the suffocating weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. She tried to steady herself, tried to force her breath to slow down, but her thoughts were a tangled mess. The man in the button-down shirt took another step forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't understand, Cheryl. You never did. But you're about to." Cheryl's mind raced as she searched for something, anything, that would give her a handle on the situation. But there was nothing. Her entire life, everything she thought she knew, felt like it was slipping through her fingers, and these men were the ones holding the strings. The newcomer, still watching her closely, finally spoke again, his voice lower this time. "You think this is still about your diner? About your family's legacy?" He shook his head slowly, a sad, almost pitying look crossing his face. "It's never been about that." Cheryl's heart skipped. She felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. "What do you mean?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. The man in the suit exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible look with the man in the button-down shirt. Then, without warning, he stepped back, allowing the newcomer to speak. "Your family," the man said, his voice colder now, "has been involved in something much bigger than you ever realized. And you? You've been a pawn in all of it." His words hit Cheryl like a punch to the gut. She felt the ground beneath her feet shift again, this time leaving her reeling. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. "What are you talking about? What do you want from me?" The man smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who had good intentions. It was sharp, calculating. "We don't want anything from you, Cheryl," he said. "We're here to make sure you understand the truth. And the truth is you've been a part of something much darker than you ever realized. Your family's legacy is built on lies. And now, it's time for you to pay the price." Cheryl's legs went weak, and she grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. The weight of his words was crushing. She had always believed that the diner, the business, her family, everything was something she could protect. But now it felt like it had all been built on a lie, on something much more dangerous than she could have imagined. "You've crossed the wrong people," the man continued, his voice hardening. "And you don't even know it." Cheryl felt her breath catch in her throat. She could barely process the enormity of what he was saying. The family she had trusted, the legacy she had spent years protecting, it was all built on something else entirely. Something darker. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the diner felt oppressive, the air thick with the weight of unspoken threats and hidden truths. Cheryl's mind was spinning. She needed answers, but the more she thought, the less she understood. And then, as if on cue, the man in the suit stepped forward again, his face unreadable. "You have a choice, Cheryl," he said, his voice as cold and final as steel. "But it's not going to be easy." The room seemed to close in around her, and the realization settled in like a stone in her stomach. Everything was about to change. Cheryl's mind was racing, and her pulse was so loud in her ears that she almost couldn't hear the words being spoken. The man in the suit was still staring at her with that unsettling calmness, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking, what she was about to do. The man in the button-down shirt had moved back, standing at the counter now, arms crossed, waiting for something. "Your choice," the man in the suit repeated, his voice cutting through her chaotic thoughts. "But you need to decide now. We've given you enough time." Her chest tightened. She wasn't sure what choice she had left. What had she gotten herself into? What was happening to everything she had worked for, everything she had believed? The diner, her family's diner, it was supposed to be a legacy, a place where memories were made, where people came for comfort. But now it felt like a cage, and the men in front of her, and the man who had just walked in, were the bars that kept her trapped inside. "What do you want from me?" Cheryl's voice cracked as she spoke, desperation creeping in. The man in the suit didn't answer right away. He only looked at her, as if waiting for her to realize something. And then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to the man standing by the counter. The one who had disappeared years ago, the one who had been part of her life, part of her past, but now seemed completely different. "He's the key," the man in the suit said, his tone colder now. "He knows everything. He's been involved in this from the beginning. He's the reason we're here." Cheryl's breath caught. The man by the counter, the one who had once been a part of her life, he had been here all along. He had been part of whatever dark web was being woven behind the scenes. The stranger at the counter pushed off from the bar and took a step forward, but this time, Cheryl saw something in his eyes that stopped her cold. It wasn't just coldness or detachment. It was regret. There was something deeply conflicted in his expression, something that didn't fit with the cruel words they had been exchanging. "I didn't want it to be this way," he said, his voice low, almost too soft for her to hear. He took another step toward her, and for a brief moment, Cheryl thought she might break down right there, too overwhelmed to keep going. But then he stopped and looked down at the counter, running a hand through his hair. "I never wanted you to be dragged into this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could protect you from it. But you're in deeper than you think. And so am I." Cheryl's heart skipped. What did that mean? Protect her from what? And how had this all turned into something so much bigger than just a diner? The man in the suit spoke again, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "This is bigger than you, Cheryl. It's bigger than your family. And now it's time for you to choose sides." "Choose sides?" Cheryl echoed, almost incredulously. What sides? Was this some sort of game she hadn't known about? But the man in the suit didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the man by the counter, his face hard. "It's too late to hide. The damage is already done. You should have walked away when you had the chance." The man by the counter, the one who had once been part of her life, finally met her gaze again, his eyes filled with regret. But then, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of determination flashed across his face, and for a moment, Cheryl could have sworn she saw a glimmer of the person she had once known. "I'm sorry," he said again, more firmly this time, as if making some kind of decision. Before Cheryl could react, the man in the suit raised his hand again, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. It was as though something, some kind of pressure, was building up, ready to snap at any moment. The silence that followed was deafening, and Cheryl felt the weight of it, felt it pressing on her chest. And then, just as the tension became unbearable, the front door of the diner creaked open again. This time, Cheryl didn't have time to react. A tall figure stepped in, but it wasn't someone she recognized. It was someone new, someone who immediately shifted the energy in the room. The newcomer was dressed in all black, his face hidden beneath a hood, his presence looming like a shadow in the doorway. Everyone in the diner turned to look at him. The man in the suit, the man by the counter, they all froze for a moment, as if they had seen a ghost. Cheryl's confusion deepened. Who was this man? And why had he entered the diner now, in the middle of everything? The newcomer didn't speak at first. He simply took a few steps forward, his movements measured and precise. And then, with a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere deep within the earth, he spoke. "It's time to end this," he said, his tone low, almost like a command. The atmosphere in the diner shifted again, like the sudden gust of a storm. Everything seemed to crackle with tension as the man in the suit turned toward the newcomer. "You shouldn't have come," the man in the suit said, his voice sharp. "This doesn't concern you anymore." The newcomer shook his head, a small smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "You're wrong," he said simply. "This has always concerned me. And now it's time to finish it." Cheryl felt her heart racing, her mind spinning in 1,000 directions. What was going on? What did this all mean? The diner, her family's legacy, had become the battleground for something much more dangerous, much more hidden than she could have imagined. And then, without warning, the man in the suit stepped toward the newcomer, his face twisted with something dark, something almost personal. "You think you can change everything with a few words?" he asked, his voice laced with a growing fury. The newcomer didn't flinch. Instead, he simply raised his hand, and in that instant, Cheryl felt the air in the diner change again. The lights flickered. The world seemed to tilt sideways. And then, everything went silent. In that moment, Cheryl realized something that sent a shiver down her spine. The man in the suit, the man by the counter, and the newcomer, they weren't just part of some business deal, some twisted conspiracy. They were all connected by something far older, far more dangerous than she could have ever known. And she had just become a part of it all. The lights flickered one last time, and then just like that everything went black. The sudden darkness was suffocating. Cheryl blinked several times, her heart pounding in her chest, as if the world had momentarily stopped. The air seemed thick, heavy with the weight of the unknown. She could feel her breath quickening, her body frozen in place. The flickering of the lights earlier hadn't been a simple malfunction. Something had happened, a shift in the atmosphere that she couldn't understand, but it was clear now that nothing was as it seemed. She heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, breaking the silence that had consumed the diner. The tension in the room was palpable, so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. But no one spoke. The only sounds were her own shallow breaths, the soft rustle of clothing, and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Cheryl couldn't see anyone anymore. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the total blackness, and yet she could sense them all standing there, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had descended, the lights flickered back to life. Cheryl squinted against the sudden brightness, her eyes struggling to find clarity. The stranger in black was still there, standing as if he had never moved, his expression unreadable. The man in the suit had also not moved, his posture still rigid, though his eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. And the man by the counter? He looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of a few minutes, his eyes wide with something akin to fear. The newcomer spoke first, his voice low but firm. "You've been playing a dangerous game. But now it's over." Cheryl felt the weight of his words, the finality in them. She wasn't sure if she should feel relief, or if she was on the edge of something far worse. But one thing was clear, she had been dragged into something she had never anticipated, something far darker and more complex than anything she could have imagined. The man in the suit responded, his voice hard, almost cold. "You think you can just walk in here and undo everything? You have no idea what you're dealing with." The stranger in black didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Cheryl, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not here to undo anything," he said, his voice softer now, as if trying to reach her. "I'm here to give you the truth. And sometimes, that truth isn't what we want to hear." Cheryl's stomach turned. Truth? What truth? Everything about this night had felt like a waking nightmare, and now, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but not in any way she could have ever predicted. "You think this diner means something to me?" The man in the suit spat, his voice rising with anger. "You think any of this means anything in the grand scheme of things?" The newcomer shook his head, his expression almost pitying. "No. This has never been about the diner. This has always been about power. And you've been holding on to a dream that was never meant to come true." Cheryl blinked, her mind whirling. Power? She had built her life around this diner, around the memories it held, around the community it had fostered. But now it felt like it was just a pawn in some larger game. A game she had been blind to for too long. "You've been manipulated," the man in the suit said, his voice laced with venom. "All of you. And now it's too late to turn back." But the stranger in black wasn't finished. He took a step forward, and for the first time, Cheryl noticed the weight in his eyes, something that spoke of years of burden, of secrets buried so deep they threatened to swallow him whole. "It's not too late," he said, his voice softer now, more controlled. "But it's time to face the truth. The truth that's been hidden for years." The words hung in the air, and Cheryl felt her mind racing. She had thought she was just a bystander in all of this, that she was simply trying to keep the diner afloat, trying to preserve what little legacy her family had left. But now it seemed that her role had been much more significant than she ever could have imagined. The man in the suit's face twisted in anger. "You can't be serious," he sneered. "You think this is the time to talk about truth? This is the moment when we decide how everything ends. Not some fairy tale where everyone gets to live happily ever after." Cheryl didn't know what to believe anymore. She had spent her whole life protecting this diner, believing in the importance of family, of legacy, of hard work. But now, everything felt like it had been a lie. The idea that it had all been part of something bigger, darker, made her question everything. The stranger in black's gaze softened. "Sometimes, Cheryl, the truth is painful. Sometimes, it forces us to confront things we never thought possible. But in the end, it's the only way to truly move forward." He turned to the man in the suit, his expression resolute. "You know what needs to happen. It's time to end this." The man in the suit's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think you can make me do something? You're too late." But the stranger in black wasn't intimidated. He simply took a step forward, his stance unshaken. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you." The silence that followed was thick with anticipation, each person in the diner standing on the precipice of something they couldn't control. And then, as if some invisible force had snapped, the man in the suit's expression changed. The coldness in his eyes evaporated, replaced with something far more vulnerable, a flicker of doubt, a moment of weakness. Cheryl watched in stunned silence as the man who had once seemed so powerful crumbled before her. His facade had cracked, and in that instant she realized that the truth, the real truth, had always been right there, just beneath the surface. The man in the suit took a shaky breath and slowly nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he muttered. "You want the truth? Fine." Cheryl felt a chill creep up her spine. This wasn't just a revelation about her family's diner. This was something much bigger, something that reached into the very core of everything she had believed. The stranger in black stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man in the suit. "Your family's diner," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "has been at the center of a much larger network. A network of power, control, and corruption. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was the heart of a system that fed on the weaknesses of others, a system that has been operating in the shadows for decades. Cheryl's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words hit her like a freight train. The diner? A center for something dark, something corrupt? How could that be? It was never about the food or the people you served. It was about what you didn't see, the stranger continued. Your family was always a part of something bigger, something that started long before you were born. And now, it's your turn to choose whether you'll stay in the shadows or step into the light. Cheryl's head spun. She had thought that the diner was a legacy, a place where people could escape the harshness of the world. But now, it felt like everything she had worked for had been built on lies. The walls of the diner seemed to close in on her, suffocating her. The truth, as painful as it was undeniable. The man by the counter finally spoke, his voice shaking with emotion. You need to walk away from this, Cheryl. It's not worth it. None of it is. For a moment, Cheryl felt the weight of his words, the same feeling of helplessness and confusion that had plagued her since the beginning. But then she felt something else rise within her, a sense of clarity, of understanding. The past was gone, but the future was hers to shape. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure how to fix everything. But she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let the diner, the place her family had built, become a symbol of the darkness she had just uncovered. It was time to take control. Time to break free. Cheryl turned to face the stranger in black, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. You're right. It's time to move forward. The man in the suit looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place, something like regret, or maybe fear. But it was too late for him now. The game was over. And with that, Cheryl stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The diner wasn't just her family's legacy anymore. It was her chance to build something new, something true. The darkness of the past would never completely fade, but the future was hers to create. And that was the only truth that mattered.